The rain lashes down in torrents. Wind howls across Falkirk Muir, tearing at sodden uniforms and extinguishing flints before they can spark. It is late afternoon on the 17th of January, 1746, and darkness is already closing in. Through the murk, Major General John Huske watches his commander's cavalry flee past him in blind panic. 80 dragoons lie dead on the slope. The left wing of King George's army breaks and runs. Thousands of Highlanders, their claymores red with blood, surge through the chaos, screaming their war cries. The battle has lasted barely 22 minutes, and it appears catastrophically lost. Huske is 54 years old, a veteran of 4 decades of continental warfare. He has served under Marlborough, fought at Malplaquet, commanded at Dettingen. He earned his stars through competence, not connections. His soldiers call him Daddy, Huske, for his uncommon care of their welfare. Now, amidst the collapsing rout, he makes the decision that will save an army and alter the course of British history. With 3 regiments, Ligoniers, Prices, and Barrels, he stands firm. He pivots them uphill into the flanks of the pursuing Jacobites. Volleys crack through the storm. The Highlanders falter, then break. By nightfall, Huske will withdraw his men in perfect order, whilst the Jacobite commanders search the darkness, wondering whether they have won or lost. Yet history barely remembers his name. The Battle of Falkirk Muir stands as the last significant Jacobite victory, the final successful Highland charge in British military history. Prince Charles Edward Stuart would claim triumph. Lieutenant General Henry Hawley, the government commander, would face humiliation and near dismissal. But the man who actually salvaged British fortunes that desperate afternoon, who prevented disaster from becoming catastrophe, has vanished into historiographical obscurity. No monuments commemorate John Huske. No popular histories celebrate his tactical acumen. He remains what he was on that rain-swept moor, the steady professional who did his duty whilst others panicked. This is the story of how one man's experience, judgment, and nerve prevented the Jacobite cause from gaining the momentum that might have sustained it through the spring of 1746. It is the story of competence triumphing over chaos, of professionalism preserving an army for the victory it would achieve 3 months later at Culloden. It is, ultimately, the story of why forgotten heroes matter. For without John Huske's intervention on Falkirk Muir, the history of Britain itself might have taken a dramatically different course. John Huske was born in 1692 in Newmarket, Suffolk, to a family of minor gentry with no particular martial tradition. His father died when John was 11. Without wealth or powerful patrons, young Huske faced the central challenge, confronting ambitious men of modest means in the early 18th century. How to make his way in a world structured entirely by patronage and connection. The answer, for thousands like him, lay in the army, that great engine of Georgian meritocracy, where competence could, occasionally, triumph over breeding. His military career began in the most inauspicious manner imaginable. In 1707, aged 15, Huske received a commission as ensign in Caulfield's regiment of foot, a unit recruited in Ireland and dispatched to garrison Barcelona during the War of the Spanish Succession. The commission was dated August 17th. Several months after the regiment had been officially disbanded. A parliamentary committee would later report that the unit had arrived in Spain significantly under strength and in considerable disarray. This bureaucratic muddle makes Huske's early movements difficult to trace, but it taught him an invaluable lesson about the realities of military administration. Chaos was normal, and survival depended on personal initiative. In March 1709, Having somehow navigated the confusion of a disbanded regiment, Huske joined the 5th Dragoon Guards in Flanders as a cornet. The regiment was commanded by William Cadogan, close aide to the Duke of Marlborough himself. This proved the decisive connection of Huske's career. Under Cadogan's eye, he fought at Malplaquet in September 1709, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The Allied forces prevailed, but at staggering cost over 20,000 casualties in a single day. Huske survived, and more importantly, he impressed Cadogan with his steadiness under fire. In March 1709, Huske received a commission as ensign in the Foot Guards, though this did not imply immediate service. Only 16 of the regiment's nominal 24 companies were actually formed. The true value of a Guards commission lay not in active duty, but in precedence. Under the practice known as double ranking, Guards officers held a second and higher Army rank. A Guards ensign ranked as a regular Army captain. Marlborough used Guards commissions strategically, rewarding competent officers who lacked wealth or family connections. For men like Huske, skilled, reliable, but without independent means, it provided the higher rank necessary for advancement, whilst their patrons remained in power. When George I succeeded Queen Anne in 1714, the political landscape shifted violently. The new Hanoverian regime needed loyal officers to counter Jacobite sympathies within the military establishment. In January 1715, Huske became a captain in the 15th Foot. In July, he received a captain's commission in the Coldstream Guards. The timing was significant. The Jacobite rising of 1715 erupted that very summer, and the Whig administration approved the detention of suspected Jacobite sympathizers, including Sir William Wyndham, a Tory leader and brother-in-law to the Earl of Hertford, who happened to be colonel of Huske's regiment. Huske was dispatched to arrest Wyndham at his home near Minehead. The baronet promised to accompany Huske after bidding farewell to his wife, then escaped through a window, given the prevailing social convention that a gentleman's word was his bond. This reflected badly on Wyndham rather than his captor. Huske escaped censure and joined Cadogan in the Dutch Republic, helping arrange transport for 6,000 Dutch troops to Scotland. It was Huske's introduction to the intelligence and logistics work that would define much of his career over the next 5 years. From 1715 to 1720, whilst maintaining his regimental commissions, Huske operated as a British political and diplomatic agent conducting anti-Jacobite operations. Treasury records note payments of £100 for a journey to Paris on particular service. Cadogan's feigned letters from The Hague, promising rewards for disclosure of Jacobite plots, explicitly invited confidence in his aide-de-camp, Colonel John Huske, whom correspondents could meet privately at Cambrai. During the 1719 Rising, Huske worked with diplomat Charles Whitworth to transfer 5 Dutch battalions to Britain, though the revolt collapsed before this became necessary. In 1720, Huske accompanied Cadogan and the Earl of Albemarle on a high-profile diplomatic mission to Vienna. The objective was to create an anti-Russian alliance and end Swedish support for Jacobite exiles. For a man of Huske's origins, this represented remarkable access to the highest circles of British diplomacy. The mission also cemented his lifelong friendship with Albemarle, a relationship that would to endure until both men's deaths, Huske eventually requesting burial beside his friend. Cadogan's death in 1726 removed Huske's principal patron. The slow pace of peacetime promotion meant that by 1739, after more than 30 years of service, he remained merely a major. He was 47 years old, unmarried, with no fortune beyond his army pay. His experience was vast, but his prospects appeared limited. The 18th century military establishment offered few rewards for mere competence divorced from political connections. The outbreak of the War of Part. The Austrian succession in December 1740 transformed everything. Huske became colonel of the 32nd Foot and transferred to Flanders. At Dettingen, on the 27th of June, 1743, he commanded a brigade under King George II, the last time a British monarch would personally lead troops in battle. Contemporary accounts reported that Huske behaved gloriously before being severely wounded. The battle itself was chaotic, the Allied forces nearly trapped by French maneuvering, but British infantry discipline prevailed. Huske's brigade held its position, under heavy fire, whilst the king's horse bolted and had to be restrained. The victory was narrow, costly, but decisive. Huske was promoted Major General in July 1743 in recognition of his service at Dettingen. He was appointed Colonel of the 23rd Foot, the Royal Welch, Fusiliers, and made Governor of Sheerness in 1745. At 53, after decades in the wilderness of peacetime stagnation, John Huske had finally achieved the rank and recognition his abilities merited. His soldiers, noting his uncommon solicitude for their welfare, bestowed upon him the affectionate nickname Daddy Huske, an extraordinary mark of respect in an age when officers routinely regarded their men as expendable resources. But the greatest test of his career lay just ahead. In August 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart landed in Scotland and raised his standard for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. The 45 had begun. Within months, Huske would face the challenge that would define his legacy: how to salvage victory from the jaws of humiliating defeat on a rain-swept Scottish moor. The strategic situation facing the British government in January 1746 was far graver than popular memory suggests. Prince Charles's Jacobite army had marched to Derby, thrown London into panic, and retreated into Scotland in good order. They had crushed Sir John Cope's forces at Tinginus, Prestonpans in September. They had laid siege to Stirling Castle. Most concerning of all, they had grown. By mid-January, the Jacobite host numbered approximately 8,000 men, the largest force assembled during the entire rebellion. French regulars, including the Irish piquet from the Irish Brigade, stiffened the Highland clans. Artillery pieces from French ships supplemented the army's resources. If the Jacobites could defeat another government army, the political repercussions might be catastrophic. To command operations in Scotland, the government appointed Lieutenant General Henry Hawley, a protege of the Duke of Cumberland. Hawley was everything John Huske was not: politically connected, supremely confident, and brutally dismissive of his enemies. Horace Walpole described him as illiterate. His soldiers knew him as Hangman Hawley for his savage discipline. He had formed an opinion, during the 1715 Rising, that Highland infantry could not stand against cavalry. This conviction would prove nearly fatal. On the 13th of January, 1746, Huske led 4,000 men north from Edinburgh towards Stirling, marching to relieve the besieged castle. Hawley followed with an additional 3,000 on the 15th. The two forces united at Falkirk on the 16th, establishing camp near the town. Hawley took comfortable lodgings at Calendar House, some 2,000 yards behind his troops. The Jacobite army, meanwhile, had taken position near Bannockburn, just outside Stirling. Prince Charles resided at Bannockburn House as guest of a Jacobite supporter, whilst his commanders debated their next move. Lord George Murray commanded the Jacobite right wing and much of the army's tactical planning. Unlike Prince Charles, Murray possessed genuine military experience and strategic sense. On the morning of the 17th of January, observing that Hawley showed no signs of advancing, Murray proposed a bold maneuver. The Jacobite army would march southwest, avoiding the main road, and seize the high. ground of Falkirk Muir overlooking the government encampment. If successful, they would command the battlefield and force Hawley to attack uphill or retreat. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, a government officer informed Hawley that the Jacobite army was advancing. Hawley refused to believe the ARFist report. He remained at Calendar House, merely instructing his troops to don their equipment as a precaution. By 2 o'clock, the situation was dire. A second messenger arrived from Major General John Huske, who commanded the government forces in Hawley's absence. The message was urgent. The Jacobites were seizing Falkirk Muir. Finally grasping the danger, Hawley galloped hatless to his camp and ordered immediate deployment. The race for the ridge became desperate. Government dragoons led the advance, filing rapidly up Maggie Wood's Lane and scrambling up the slope. Infantry followed, in column. As the leading elements crested the summit, they beheld the Jacobite army bearing down from the northwest. Both forces were strung out, neither properly formed. The weather, which had been threatening all day, chose that moment to break. Heavy rain lashed the exposed moor. Wind howled across the treeless expanse. Visibility collapsed. Gunpowder cartridges grew sodden. In the subsequent fighting, 1 musket in 4 would misfire. The government army formed hastily, facing west. On the left stood 3 dragoon regiments, Ligoniers, Cobhams, and Hamiltons. To their right, deployed 5 infantry regiments in the first line, Wolfes, Cholmondeleys, Pulteney's, the Royal Scots, and Price's. Ligoniers' 59th Regiment anchored the far right. Behind them stood the second line, Blakeney's, Munro's, Fleming's, Barrel's, and Battero's. Howard's Old Buffs formed a reserve in third position. 2 artillery pieces became stuck in mud at the bottom of the slope, useless. The Glasgow militia formed up behind the dragoons. Argyll militiamen took position on the far right. The government force numbered approximately 7,000 men regulars from Flanders, hardened veterans of continental warfare. Facing them, the Jacobite army deployed in 3 lines. The front line comprised the Highland clans in their traditional order, MacDonald regiments on the right, then Camerons, Frasers, Macphersons, Macintoshes, Mackenzies, Farquharsons, and Stuarts of Appin. The second line held Lord Lewis Gordon's regiment, Lord Ogilvy's men, and the Athol Brigade. The third line contained cavalry and the French regulars. Prince Charles stationed himself in the rear with the Irish piquet as reserve. Lord George Murray personally led the MacDonald regiments on the right wing, dismounting to march with them. The deployment created an unusual tactical situation. Government dragoons on the left directly opposed Highland infantry on the Jacobite right cavalry against foot. The government infantry's left faced the Jacobite center. 3 government regiments on the right completely overlapped the Jacobite left, but a ravine separated the forces, preventing flanking movements whilst protecting both sides. It was an encounter battle conducted in deteriorating conditions by commanders who could barely see their own formations, let alone coordinate, complex maneuvers. At 4 o'clock, with daylight already failing, Colonel Francis Ligonier received Hawley's order: charge the Jacobite right with 3 dragoon regiments. Hawley's tactical assumption that cavalry must break Highland infantry was about to be tested. The dragoons advanced at a trot, their horses struggling on wet ground. The Highlanders waited. At pistol range, Murray's MacDonald regiments delivered a devastating volley. 80 dragoons fell dead immediately. Horses screamed and plunged. A handful of horsemen closed with the Highland line only to meet an unexpected response. Highlanders dropped to the ground, using their dirks to hamstring horses and stab fallen riders. Others aimed their swords at horses' heads rather than riders, causing the wounded animals to circle and throw their masters into the Highland dirks. Cobham's dragoons fled north, between the battle lines. Hamilton's and Ligonier's regiments bolted to the rear, riding directly over one company of Glasgow militia and scattering them. The complete rout of the cavalry compromised the entire government position. The Highland right and centre, seeing the dragoons flee, could not be restrained. They fired a single volley, cast down their muskets, and launched the Highland charge, that terrible rushing assault that had broken armies for generations. The government infantry's left wing, attacked in front and flank with rain beating in their faces and their powder sodden, fired one ineffective volley and ran. Panic spread. The second-line regiments, instead of holding firm, broke and followed the first line in rout. Thousands of King George's soldiers streamed back down the slope towards Falkirk in complete disorder. The battle, begun less than 20 minutes earlier, appeared catastrophically lost. On the government right, 3 regiments alone held position. Price's and Ligonier's infantry, shielded by the ravine in their front, maintained formation. Huske immediately grasped the tactical situation. He brought Barrel's regiment forward from the second line. With these 3 units, he executed the maneuver that would save the army. He marched them a short distance uphill, then pivoted to fire into the flank of the Highlanders, pursuing the fleeing government left wing. The volleys crashed out through the storm. Highlanders, scattered in pursuit and looting fallen enemies, suddenly found themselves under disciplined fire from 3 sides. They had no loaded weapons with which to respond. The Highland charge depended on shock and cold steel, not firefights. Unable to close with their new tormentors and suffering mounting casualties, they began to pull back. Cobham's dragoons, having rallied, attempted to attack the Jacobite rear, but were repulsed by the Irish piquets. The French regulars held in reserve. Darkness was now complete. The storm intensified. Both armies dissolved into confusion. Most of the government force fled towards Linlithgow, grenadiers dragging abandoned artillery pieces behind them. The Jacobite army scattered some in pursuit, many looting the dead, the Highlanders unsure whether they had won or lost. Lord George Murray retained control of the Atholl Brigade and some MacDonald units, but he lost sight of the enemy in the darkness and storm. Only at dawn would Jacobites discover 300 government soldiers lying dead in the rain and realize they had achieved victory. But John Huske had achieved something far more important than victory. He had prevented annihilation. His 3 regiments withdrew in perfect order to the government camp at Falkirk, then continued the controlled retreat to Linlithgow. The bulk of the government army survived intact. Within 2 weeks, the Duke of Cumberland would arrive in Edinburgh to take personal command. By April, that reconstituted army would meet the Jacobites again at Culloden Moor and crush them utterly. Falkirk was a Jacobite victory, the last significant one they would ever achieve. But it was John Huske who ensured it was not a Jacobite triumph. The difference would prove decisive. The immediate aftermath of Falkirk revealed the narrowness of the government's escape. Official casualty returns claimed only 280 losses, but the true figure exceeded 350 killed, wounded, or missing, with another 300 captured. Sir Robert Munro and 3 lieutenant colonels lay among the dead. Colonel Francis Ligonier died of illness shortly after the battle. Government forces abandoned tents, ammunition, wagons, and 3 artillery pieces. The psychological impact was severe. King George's regulars had been routed by Highlanders yet again. Lieutenant General Hawley faced immediate censure. Contemporary accounts castigated his negligence in remaining at Calendar House whilst his army deployed, his failure to bring artillery into action, his misguided reliance on cavalry against Highland infantry. In a characteristic display of brutal scapegoating, Hawley hanged every deserter he could apprehend and cashiered Captain Cunningham, the artillery officer, whose guns became mired in mud. A court-martial conducted a ceremony of degradation, stripping Cunningham of his commission in ritualized humiliation. For Hawley himself, only Cumberland's patronage preserved his command. John Huske received no public recognition whatever. Contemporary dispatches mentioned his name perfunctorily, if at all. The official narrative emphasized government defeat rather than competent tactical recovery. Yet, amongst military professionals, Huske's reputation soared. The Dictionary of National Biography, compiled in the 19th century, notes that by his judicious conduct at the Battle of Falkirk, where he was second in command to Hawley, he secured the retreat of the royal forces to Linlithgow. Modern historian Jacqueline Riding writes that the regiments under Huske held their ground, allowing the bulk of the army to withdraw in good order. Why did the Jacobites fail to capitalize on their victory? The answer reveals much about 18th century warfare's limitations. The Highland army remained in or near Falkirk for most of the following month. Prince Charles fell ill and remained at Bannockburn House, nursed by Clementina Walkinshaw, whilst his commanders squabbled over strategy. Lord George Murray recognized that they should pursue Hawley immediately, but lacked the command authority to override the prince's circle of Irish advisers. The French artillery expert, Monsieur Mirabel de Gordon, proved spectacularly incompetent, destroying one of the siege cannon after firing a single shot at Stirling Castle. The Scots thereafter referred to him as Mr. Admirable. The Duke of Mai. Cumberland arrived in Edinburgh on the 30th of January, 1746. He immediately set about reorganizing and retraining the army. Crucially, Cumberland recognized the value of experienced commanders like Huske. When the campaign resumed, Huske commanded the reserves on the Wild. Government left at Culloden on the 16th of April. Once again, his tactical acumen proved decisive. At Culloden, the Jacobite Highland charge struck the government left wing with tremendous force. The front rank gave ground under the assault. Huske brought his second-line troops forward and executed a flanking maneuver, exposing the Highlanders to volleys from three sides simultaneously. Unable to respond effectively and suffering catastrophic casualties, the Highland clans broke and fled. The battle lasted less than 40 minutes. Jacobite losses exceeded 1,200 dead, many killed during the pitiless pursuit that followed. The 45 was over. The Jacobite cause was finished. Huske was promoted lieutenant general for his service during the Rising and returned to Flanders. His regiment, the 23rd Foot, suffered heavy casualties in the Allied defeat at Laufeld in July 1747. Shortly afterwards, Cumberland dispatched him to inspect Bergen op Zoom, then besieged by the French. The fortress surrendered in September. Huske's active military career effectively ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. He was 56 years old. The remaining 13 years of his life passed in comfortable obscurity, although appointed governor of Jersey in 1749. Huske appears to have visited the island only once, in 1751. Delegation of such sinecures was common practice. He paid a deputy to perform the actual duties whilst retaining the income. He purchased a small estate in Ealing, then outside London, and rented a house in Albemarle Street. When his regiment was sent to Minorca in 1755, he did not accompany it. The garrison surrendered to French forces in June 1756 in the opening engagement of the 7 Years' War. A subsequent investigation revealed appalling neglect. Crumbling walls, rotten gun platforms, and over 35 senior officers absent from their posts, including the colonels of all 4 garrison regiments. Huske was among them, though such absenteeism was entirely normal for officers of his rank and era. He never married. When he died in London on the 18th of January, 1761, 15 years to the day after Falkirk, his will revealed substantial wealth, £41,000, including real estate and a stud of horses. He left £5,000 to his head groom, £3,000 to his valet, £100 to the poor of Newmarket, and £2,000 to Charles d'Auvergne, who had deputized for him in Jersey. As instructed, he was buried without ceremony in Grosvenor Chapel. His coffin placed beside that of his lifelong friend, the Earl of Albemarle, who had died in 1754. Why has history forgotten John Huske? Several factors conspire to erase competent subordinates from popular memory. First, the Battle of Falkirk itself occupies an awkward position in British military history, a defeat sandwiched between the disaster at Prestonpans and the triumph at Culloden. Narratives prefer clear victories or instructive disasters, not complex engagements where tactical skill salvaged strategic failure. Second, Huske lacked the personal drama that drives popular history. He was neither heroically victorious like Cumberland at Culloden, nor catastrophically incompetent like Cope at Prestonpans. He was merely competent, and competence rarely makes for compelling storytelling. Third, he was a subordinate who saved his superior's reputation. Hawley survived Falkirk politically because Huske prevented complete disaster. Historical narratives naturally focus on commanders rather than the officers, who quietly ensure those commanders' plans do not collapse entirely. Yet Huske's influence extended beyond his immediate actions. The army that crushed the Jacobites at Culloden was the army he helped preserve at Falkirk. The tactical doctrine developed after Falkirk infantry battalions, trained to deliver controlled volleys, whilst supporting units maneuvered on flanks, reflected the improvised solution Huske executed on Falkirk Muir. His demonstration that disciplined regulars could defeat Highland charges if properly handled and supported influenced British tactical thinking for decades. The 7 Years' War regiments that would win global victories from Quebec to Plassey embodied lessons learned in the rain and darkness of that January evening in 1746. Modern military historians recognize Huske's significance. Trevor Royal, in his History of Culloden, notes Huske's crucial role at both Falkirk and the final battle. Jacqueline Riding's comprehensive study of the 45 gives Huske credit for tactical competence that contemporary official accounts minimized. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography describes his judicious conduct saving the army at Falkirk, but these scholarly acknowledgments rarely penetrate popular consciousness. The wider public remembers Bonnie Prince Charlie, Butcher, Cumberland, the romance of the lost cause. They do not remember Daddy Huske, the steady professional who did his duty whilst others fled. Stand today on Falkirk Muir, and you will find monuments to the battle, information boards explaining the Jacobite victory, memorials to the Highland dead. Walk through Edinburgh's military museums, and you will encounter extensive exhibits on Culloden, on Bonnie Prince Charlie's campaign, on the romantic tragedy of the 45. Search for John Huske, and you will find virtually nothing. No statues commemorate his service. No battlefield markers acknowledge his tactical intervention. He rests in Grosvenor Chapel beside his friend Albemarle, but few pause at his grave. He has become what he was in life, invisible except to those who understand what actually happened. This obscurity is both unjust and instructive. Military history tends to remember either brilliant innovators or spectacular failures, not the competent professionals who prevent failure from becoming catastrophe. Yet armies depend more upon the Huskes than upon the occasional genius. For every Wellington who wins Waterloo, a dozen steady brigadiers must hold positions, execute difficult retreats, and salvage tactical situations through experience and nerve. These men rarely achieve fame. They are the hidden hands that make victory possible. John Huske's career encapsulates the virtues the British Army cultivated in the 18th century: patience, technical competence, concern for soldiers' welfare, calm judgment under pressure, and subordination of personal ambition to duty. He waited decades for promotion, served loyally under less capable commanders, and executed his responsibilities without complaint or glory-seeking. When crisis came at Falkirk, he responded with the tactical flexibility that only experience provides. He recognized immediately that the battle's outcome mattered less than the army's survival. He identified the 3 regiments that could hold. He maneuvered them into position. He withdrew them in good order. He saved an army. 3 months later, that preserved army destroyed the Jacobite cause forever at Culloden. The subsequent pacification of the Highlands, conducted with savage brutality, eliminated armed resistance to Hanoverian rule. British political stability enabled the economic and imperial expansion of the later 18th century. The 7 Years' War, which would make Britain the dominant global power, became possible only because the government controlled Scotland securely. None of this was inevitable. If Hawley's army had been annihilated at Falkirk, if the Jacobites had gained momentum and political support, if the French had landed substantial forces in support, the history of Britain and the world might have diverged dramatically. John Huske did not win the 45. The Duke of Cumberland won at Culloden. But Huske ensured there would be a Culloden, that there would be an army capable of delivering that victory. In doing so, he exemplified a truth that modern military professionals understand, but popular audiences often miss. Wars are won less by brilliant commanders than by competent subordinates who execute orders skillfully, adapt to chaos effectively, and preserve forces when circumstances collapse. We remember the romantic failures Charles Edward Stuart walking 3,500 miles disguised as a maidservant after Culloden. We remember the brutal victors Cumberland earning his sobriquet Butcher through systematic suppression. We ought also to remember the steady professionals like John Huske, who asked only to do their duty competently and who, in doing so, shaped the course of nations. The rain still lashes Falkirk Muir. The wind still howls across that treeless expanse. And somewhere in the darkness, 3 regiments still stand firm whilst chaos breaks around them, held in position by the quiet competence of a man who understood that glory matters less than getting the job done. That is John Huske's legacy. That is why forgotten heroes deserve remembrance, not because they sought fame, but because they made history possible for those who did.